Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you this evening. Today, I'm going to talk about a view from Kilmartin. And what I was really pleased to do when I was preparing this lecture is think particularly about our understanding of prehistoric textiles in Scotland, because that's something that we don't often have the opportunity to hear about the evidence, particularly in Scotland. So hence a view from Kilmartin. So first of all, when I say that I investigate ancient textiles, often people ask me, "Well, is there anything left?" And so that question of "is there anything left" is about the preservation, because of course people know that if you leave something like clothing outside, it will rot away, and that will be quite quick. So how do you get these textiles from these very ancient periods? So this chart is just to give you an idea of some of the preservation conditions. A very important factor is the climate. Whether things are deteriorating will depend on conditions such as, is it a very dry climate to stop the microbes growing on the textiles? That will help preserve them. Or if they're frozen. Also, wet, waterlogged environments are very good because they don't allow the aerobic action of the microbes that will break things down. There are also microclimates, things such as caves, natural disasters. So climate's very important, but another very important factor is the matrix. And by that, we don't mean the film, but the surrounding soil matrix. What's the material, the chemistry of that environment? And so the preservation will depend on whether something's in a slightly acidic or alkali environment, a salty environment, also whether it's in contact with metals. In terms of transformations, then we might have ways that the textiles and in fact other organic materials might be transformed, maybe through charring, carbonization, or through becoming imprints in something. So a textile pressed into the roof tile or something like this. So what does that actually look like when we think about archaeological examples? If we start on the left, as you're looking at the screen, is mineral preserved textiles. This is where organic materials have been in contact with metal. And it's actually those metal ions impregnating the textiles or covering them that creates a special chemical environment that preserves them. And that you can see by that green colored textile on the copper alloy dagger.
Susanna, sorry to interrupt you there. Have you got a phone charging near you by any chance?
Yes. Is that causing the feedback?
A little bit of feedback.
Okay. We've taken that away. Is that any better?
Not much better. This wasn't a problem before you started. However, if you just want to keep going, I think we might struggle to get to the root of that problem, essentially. But it was fine before, so if you just want to keep going, I think we could still hear you clearly. It was just there's a bit of feedback, that's all.
Okay. Let's see. When there's next feedback, let me know. I'm not sure quite what I can do about it. I can turn off another.
Yeah, if there's any other audio devices plugged in, if you could turn them off.
Turn off the printer, which is connected to the internet. Okay. Maybe. Okay. We'll see how we're getting along then. So other ways things might be, other examples at Muss Farm, as Ken mentioned before, this is a preservation through both charring and being wet. And the imprint on the vessel that you can see to the right is an imprint through being an impression on clay. And there's the waterlogged burials from Denmark, which are excellent examples of waterlogged preservation in slightly acidic environment. So what we have are these very special preservation environments that just through the mixture of chemistry, environment, or the physical things that have happened to them actually become preserved. And across Britain, there are a number of sites. Besides Must Farm, maybe sort of 100 or so fragments of textile, numerous impressions. And so you have this scattering of evidence, and it's a matter of bringing that together in some form that's trying to try and get the most out of it, and also to work on analyses that will help you understand the evidence to the best effect. So what is a textile then? Most textile scientists would agree that it can be defined as a web of interlaced threads produced on a loom. However, there are numerous objects that do not fall easily into that precise definition. And there are several classes of fibre artifact that derive from separate but related technologies. So this definition really brings together a number of different technologies. We have the textile produced on the loom. We've got threads. These are yarns that are produced by some forms of twisting and spinning. And then there are fibres, things that might come from sheep, plants, maybe silk in other periods. And so there's a great deal of technological knowledge that goes into making textiles. And this changes over time, and we will see some of those changes in Scotland and Britain more broadly. So not only is textiles really complex technologies, but textiles then are also technologies of material culture. So once you have your textile, that textile is then made into something, made into clothing, bags, horse saddles, sails, all sorts of different things. So it's made into objects, and those are then combined in all sorts of different ways. And costumes are a really great example of that, where lots of different textiles are brought together. So when you're studying archaeological textiles, actually you're dealing with all sorts of different technologies. And so quite often it's a matter of thinking as you go along, well, what's the evidence? What can I understand from this evidence? And maybe what don't I understand so well? So, for example, when you've just got tiny fragments, it's very, you can't usually understand the clothing or the costume, but you might understand the fibre very well, and the technology of making yarns and textiles. So as I've already touched on already, well, what are textiles used for? And here we can think, looking back at Irene Good's work again, and think of textiles as the craft of using fibre to produce goods ranging from floor mats to bridal dowries, addressing all three of the basic human needs: food, clothing, and shelter. In short, textiles are just hugely important to human societies, found in all sorts of different places being used for different things, whether they're part of industries of packing and containing, or whether they're clothing as something we just think of as fundamentally textiles or tents, but also things that were traded, things that were gifts. And so things that were very important in other aspects of the economy, of ways of creating relationships between people, indebtedness, exchanging for other goods. So how then do archaeologists investigate textiles? There are many different ways we look at material culture, and one way is thinking specifically about those, understanding the technologies, such as the technologies of making yarn and textiles. So if we investigate from what we call a macroscopic perspective, so broadly the dimensions of our eye, with maybe magnification up to 20 times magnification, quite low magnification, here we might be trying to understand, say, the weave structure, how something's interwoven. We can observe that. We might look at how the yarns are made, how many, the thread counts, how many threads there are per centimetre as a way to broadly understand the coarseness or fineness of the fabric. If we then take this to the microscopic level, we're able to do different things. In particular with textiles, we'll be looking at fibres and trying to identify different fibres, looking at the cellular structure to understand whether it's a plant fibre or an animal fibre, and maybe elements of how that fibre has been processed and made into yarn. There are then all sorts of chemical and biological analyses we might do. So, for example, chemical analysis to understand if there are any traces of dye stuff, to understand colour. Spoiler alert, there's not a great deal of that in this talk because the Bronze Age actually is a very tricky time for understanding colour. Textiles are also really important for radiocarbon dating because, of course, they're organic materials, they contain carbon. So actually they're a great source for dating. There are other ways, such as through working through digital imaging. Of course, photographs with cameras, a classic way of recording and then being able to study those textiles and all sorts of different things in detail. But then there are techniques such as RTI, reflectance transformation imaging, which is a way of looking at imprints in particular to understand the structures, to understand details of surfaces, micrographs through all sorts of different microscopes that an element of digital imaging. So we can see there are many different ways we go about trying to understand textiles. And we're trying to understand these details to then think about those broader context of textiles in past societies. So what I want to do today is think about the Scottish evidence for textiles in the broader context of Britain. And I want to start at the Ness of Brodgar, which is an ongoing excavation up in the Orkneys. And it's been hugely important for understanding the Neolithic. So here we're looking at the period before the Bronze Age, and we're looking at around evidence or the information I'll talk about of around 3000 BCE. And what's been very exciting as they've excavated that site is they found lots of ceramics, which is no surprise. That's material that survives very well on archaeological digs. But as you can see in these two images, there are ceramics that have impressions on their base. And in the image on the right, you can see these curved lines on the bottom of that pot. And actually, this is an impression of coiled basketry. In the image on the left, there's an impression of cord. And this is a 2-ply cord. And it's just a beautiful, clear impression with aspects of the sort of fibrous material of that cord showing up, which points to it being a plant fibre. And this just gives a very nice picture of some of the organic materials at these Neolithic sites, because in Britain, Neolithic organic materials are just incredibly rare. And really the best evidence is through these impressions. So when I say coiled basketry, what are we talking about here? There's an image here of Jimmy Work from Shetland making a coiled basketry pot. And what you can see is there's a central, if you can see that fibrous material that's sort of splaying out, there's a central core, and that's wound around and around and stitched together. In the case of Jimmy Work working in 2007, he's using string. But the pots, the basketry that was being made at Ness of Brodgar was actually using the strands of fibre to stitch the coils in place. So this is where we come to Kilmartin. Again, we're thinking of imprints. And this is a vessel that comes from Upper Largy, which is a pit, a sort of broadly rectangular pit that contains several ceramic vessels as well as some flints. This was excavated around a decade or so ago. and dates to the mid 3rd millennium BCE. And what's interesting about this vessel is you can see these impressions on it, making the patterns. And if you look in detail here for this vessel, the top of this vessel, the impression is actually an impression of a piece of cord. And so the cord is being used here to make decoration on vessels. One of the ways we think about the technologies of producing cord and thread is to think about the direction of twist. And we talk about this in terms of it being S or Z. So if you look at the center of that S twist, there's a direction to it, and that's the opposite to the Z. If we look at that, we have to then look at that in this direction. So sort of at 90 degrees, the letters that I've shown you on the screen, to understand what the twist is. And while that looks like a Z twist in the impression, of course, the impression is in the mirror of what actually impressed into it. So this is applied cord twisted in an S direction. And so this gives us an understanding of the type of technologies. And I think this is really fascinating because while fabrics from this period are just incredibly rare, and we have a bit of a blank of really understanding what they are, we can see that this cord technologies, it not only is it around, and to be honest, I had very little doubt that people would be using string at this point. Really, that's actually they're using this to make decorations on ceramic, and this is very delicate work. If you try and make this sort of decoration on ceramic, you've got to be very careful. There's all this flexible string. It's not so easy to do. This is another example from Kilmartin, another of these cord impressed vessels from Upper Largy, from this pit, burial pit. And again, we have this S-twisted cord yarn, and this beaker and the other one, in fact, are very early examples of cord impressed beakers. A work by Alison Sheridan puts them coming from continental Europe as some of the earliest examples of this type of ceramic. Because in fact, this type of ceramic, the beakers, and then other types of vessels called food vessels in Scotland, actually were very long-lived and very popular. And so this impressing of string into ceramics lasts for a very long time. And we don't really understand why exactly these decorations were used in the string. But I think what's really fascinating is this technology is there and present in ways that we don't expect for decoration. So I've talked about the different impressions from the Ness of Brodgar and Kilmartin. So what were the fibres that were used to make this, to make the string, the cord for these impressions? When we try and identify fibres from preserved textiles, we're looking at high magnification of over 500 times magnification. So looking at in minute detail at different cellular structure. It's not possible to do that on ceramic vessels. There just isn't that preservation at that scale. But what it is possible to do is see that these have the definition of plant fibres. And the sort of plant fibres that we expect were being used at that point are quite possibly bast fibres. And bast is fibres that come from the stems of all sorts of different plants. And they come from this position D, the fibre bundles, underneath the epidermis or the bark of the plant. And various different plants have usable bast fibres. All sorts of trees have bast fibres. Lime is particularly good, also elm. Nettles, flax, these are other sources of bast fibres. And so some of the earliest fibrous material that's used in Britain were plant fibres. So how were they being made? one of the things that I love doing in teaching is teaching people how to make string, actually, because it's such a fascinating technology and something that people can try. And they just really enjoy learning how to do it and then pulling their string apart. That's also quite exciting. The way that this is made is a technology that it can have different words and how people describe it. We can think of this as a sort of splicing technique. In terms of plant fibers, you're adding in plant fibers sort of in strips, in strands, and you're twisting those in, and then you're plying them. So an individual thread is then plied, which is the mechanism of using two or more threads to create a stronger yarn. So this is a technology we can talk of as splicing. And these diagrams are me trying to show these different ways that multiple strips of plant fibre are then twisted together, both first in individual single strands and then plied into these multiple strand groups. One thing that Ken asked me to talk about today was to think about clothing. And from what I've already said of the different technologies of the thread, the textiles and clothing, it's very hard to get an idea of clothing from these early periods, because what we have are impressions and ideas maybe from some of the pins and fastenings people might use on garments to how they might have been. And so it becomes really difficult to understand for periods such as this Chalcolithic or the Beaker, this early Bronze Age period that I'm showing you here in this timeline, what people might have worn. And one of the best sources of evidence, in fact, in Europe, in fact, is a long way away. And these are these stone statues, which I'm showing you two diagrams of here from Sion and Aosta in Switzerland, and also there's a site in northern Italy, Aosta. And they show people wearing these wonderful, fascinating garments with little diamond and triangular patterns. And quite often this is how you'll find people reconstructing clothes of that period. It actually comes from this information in Switzerland. The wonderful exhibition, The World of Stonehenge, which is on at the British Museum at the moment, has a book, and also in the exhibition has this beautiful diagram, the illustration of potentially some of the clothing from that period. But in terms of Scotland, we remain in a bit of a blank. No doubt people were using fabrics and animal skins to make clothing, but it's very hard to understand what that was. So if we move on a little bit in time, and if we look now, we're looking around 2000 BCE, there's a really interesting group of sort of cluster of evidence of finds. And these are from what we call short kist burials. So if you can see the man excavating the burial here in the snow, it's like a stone kist that's a little bit over a metre long, that's been dug into the ground and covered by that huge capstone. And this is actually a type of burial that occurred in different parts of Scotland. And the burial was then crouched inside that and the capstone put over. And every now and then there are preserved organic remains in these kists. This example from Langwell Farm in Strath-Oichel, which is east of Ross, so right up in the north, centre north east of Scotland, was found by a farmer, John White, as he was working his field. He dislodged the capstone. And he took some photographs immediately because he realized he'd found something very ancient. And what you can see, those dark areas, are part of a twined fabric. And this is some analysis I did actually only from the photographs, because unfortunately the burial was disturbed, not by the farmer, but by other people very shortly afterwards. So his photographs are actually really important. This is really exciting because this is one of the first indications of the type of fabric that was used in Scotland. And so I've made a diagram of this twined fabric, which has in the horizontals there's what we call passive elements, and then working down on the verticals of these two twisted yarns that sort of hold it together, a little bit like those sort of rush beach mats that you sometimes get with the green edging. It's a fabric a little bit like that. And so this is very exciting to start to see some of these early fabrics in Scotland. This is a reconstruction that David Hogg did for North Lytton Historic Environment Scotland that show what they think that fabric may have looked like in the burial. And it's a matter of, well, it's not entirely clear whether this was like a full blanket that covered the person, or maybe some kind of headwear and a shorter cover, but something of that nature. In the same burial, there was also part of a preserved cattle hide, these tufts of dark reddy brown hair. And so there were two different fabrics there covering and wrapping this burial. So this is really exciting early material. And there are a number of different short kists that have similar twined fabrics, also sheepskin, not a wool textile, but a sheepskin found up in Spinningwell. And so there's actually a very interesting cluster in Scotland of short kist burials with these twined fabrics and animal hides. I'm moving now really far south in the British Isles, and to look at another example of a kist burial. And this is on Dartmoor. This is Whitehorse Hill Kist, and this is something I worked on a number of years ago now. And there's something very different here, and I think I put this in because I think it makes a very nice contrast to what's going on in Scotland with these twined fabrics, and maybe pointing to some of the differences regionally. So here we can see the images of the excavation of this short kist on Dartmoor. And this was preserved because of the dampness of the peat. So this is a damp, not exactly waterlogged, but this slightly acidic damp environment has allowed the preservation of organic materials. And the brown splodgy bit, and it's all very brown and splodgy, but very exciting, I can assure you, is the textile as we first saw it after the first stage of conservation. And I wonder if you can make out here in the diagram, what you have is a strip of textile around 6 centimetres wide. And to either side of these little clusters of pieces of leather with leather beading along the edge. So it's a combination of a textile and leather object that's been made to be decorative, this fancy item. We don't know exactly what it was used for. It's found in a kist with the burial, but it's just a beautiful example of some of the decorative aspects of textiles, because quite often that's something we're lacking, yet surely people were interested in that side, which is just what we see here. The kist at Whitehorse Hill had a number of other remains in it. So it had the textile with the leather triangles, also had a braid made out of cow hair with tin beads, a coiled basket, so going back to that technology that we also see at the Ness of Brodgar about 1,000 years before, clay beads of flint, wooden studs, sticks, and all. And also the cremated remains, which was the human remains in this burial. And what was really interesting is that there were just tiny fragments of another textile found in those cremated remains. And these were preserved by being charred through the cremation and then being kept damp. What's really fascinating about Whitehorse Hill Kist is that it has this combination of organic and inorganic materials. And here we're seeing this remarkable preservation. But if we take away that organic preservation and look at the cremated remains, the beads, the flint, this is what we find really very commonly in burials of this period. And so it's a reminder of what's missing, that yes, we find the flints, and this is typically what we see. But with the organic materials, we just see this very rich world concerned with the decoration and the technologies that were included there. So I think this is a very nice example of what we lose when we look at sites without the organic material, and indeed what we gain when it's preserved. So in terms of technologies, here I've introduced for the first time the preserved textiles. Throughout the Bronze Age in Britain, actually the textile technology is really rather consistent. These are technologies of what we call plain weave fabrics, so simple 1 over 1 under weave, so that then alternate in each row. And these diagrams show you variations of that. So here this is in a balanced variation, and here the vertical yarns are squeezed together, but it's the same 1 over 1 under textile. It's quite likely that, well, we're certain that certainly in some cases, a warp-weighted loom was being used to weave the textiles, but possibly other weaving devices were used to make narrow bands. If we then move over to the east of the country, to Cambridgeshire, there's another early Bronze Age burial that has something else rather interesting going on. And this is the Barrow at Over. These funny browny black objects that you see in the image on top of the barrow during excavation are the preserved textiles. And they're rather unglamorous clumps, but they actually tell a really fascinating story about this barrow. In these diagrams, I looked at the different layers of textiles within them. So I'm looked at here, for example, if you look at the top, there are 3 layers of textiles. But if we look on one side, there are up to 10 different layers of textiles. So there's a great deal going on with those textiles. And these clumps, they're just multiple layers of textiles. So what exactly is going on here? The textiles were made, so this is the analysis to look at the fibres. This carried out by my colleague Margarita Glaber. And this is using scanning electron microscopy to look at the individual fibres used to make the yarns. And looking at characteristic features such as little nodes in these single fibres that come from the stems and this polygonal cross-section of those fibres, these can be identified as flax, Linum usitatissimum, or other, potentially other similar bast fibre. So these multiple layers of fabric are rather interesting. So what could they have been used for? And it's possible that they could be some form of quilting using multiple layers to create a padded effect. There was no stitching to suggest that. So I don't see the evidence for it being quilting. It could be that whole bundles of textiles were put onto the pyre. As we see in this second diagram, it could be that they were just stacking this fire full of textiles in a way of maybe giving gifts to the dead or putting their possessions with them. Or it could be that the whole body was wrapped in multiple layers of textile before it was put on the pyre. I think it's quite likely that the body was being wrapped, or some kind of textiles are being put in the fire, especially as the plant fibre textiles are particularly flammable. And so this is interesting for thinking about adding to the richness of what we understand about the sort of ceremonies and practices in that period. So what then can we understand about clothing as we come into this fuller Bronze Age? Again, from the British Isles, it's very hard to understand that from these small fragments. If we look to Denmark, some of the sources that have been hugely influential from Denmark and northern Germany, which just give a hugely evocative sense of how people, what people would have worn in the Bronze Age. And this is a woman's burial. It has this top with short sleeves, there's a string skirt. There are other burials, men's burials with sort of wrap-around tunic-like garments, cloths for wrapping the feet, cloaks. And these finds have been hugely influential. So when you look at recreations of clothing in the Bronze Age, quite often they'll be based on that. And I think this is a very reasonable interpretation of what's going on in the Bronze Age. So these are some examples. To the example in the centre lower is from the World of Stonehenge exhibition, new images commissioned. I'm also pleased to include the Kilmartin recreation by Aaron Watson, which I think is a lovely imaginative way of trying to bring life into the Glebe reconstruction at Kilmartin. But textiles, of course, weren't just used for clothing. And another really interesting cluster of finds from Scotland are textiles that are found in Bronze Age hoards. These date to the late Bronze Age, and by hoards, I mean sort of buried groups of objects that have been buried in the ground. And often what remains are the metal parts of those hoards, because of course these preserve underground far better than organic materials. What's interesting, there's a cluster around Fife and Angus, where some of these, the soil and the environment has been conducive to preserving some textiles. And what we see now for the first time in Scotland, and actually some of the early examples in Britain, is the preservation of wool textiles. There's actually wool textiles from the sheep. They come later than plant textiles. And this is just what we're seeing in the evidence in Britain. But there are several of these hoards with just tiny fragments of preserved textiles. Some of the textiles we use to wrap the hoards, wrap the blades, to tie them together, and also to stuff the socket where it would have been attached to the haft. Another example comes from of this wool textiles in burials, comes from Yorkshire in Rilston. And this is another of the wool textiles. And I want to draw attention to this just to start thinking a little bit about the technology of wool. What is not always apparent is that there's an evolution in the sheep fleece. And this was first understood in the 1960s by Michael Ryder. And broadly, what you see in these diagrams is that sheep, what he's doing is measuring 100 fibers from a textile to look at the diameter of those fibers. And if we look at this first chart, we see this cluster of fibers with very fine fibers with less than 20 micron diameter. And then we see these thicker fibers, these hairs with up to 100 micron diameter. And this is the profile of a hairy sheep. As time goes on over the millennia, people realize they don't want hairy sheep because they're prickly and they're not very comfortable to wear. What they want is just that fine wool. And they breed sheep to have a profile more like this, the fine wool, with fibers with less than 40 micron in diameter. And so I did this analysis on the Rilston textile in Yorkshire. And what's interesting is you see what is called a generalized medium wool. It has the fine fibers, but it still has some of these hairier fibers. And we can see that yarn here. And you can see some of those hairy elements in that yarn. So this is early on in the evolution of the sheep fleece in Britain. These wools are still a little bit prickly. People haven't quite got to the point of making very fine wools yet. Scotland and the Rilson example from Yorkshire, so northern Britain, is really interesting for understanding late Bronze Age walls. And that's where we start to understand that technology. And we're going to come back to Scotland to look for some of the early Iron Age walls in just a minute. But what I want us to do is drop into thinking about Must Farm, which Ken talked about in the introduction. Must Farm in Cambridgeshire is a late Bronze Age settlement site. And what I'm showing you here is a diagram of a number of round structures at that site. And the site has a palisade around it, and it's preserved through a combination of being charred and waterlogged. And here we can see that excavation going on in 2016. On the timeline here, we're looking at around 800 BCE. The site had a number of structures that were built above the water, and around 850 there was a fire. Everything caught alight. They're made out of wood and thatch, and it burnt, and those structures fell into the silty waterway that it stood above. And what this created was wonderful preservation of the wooden rafters. And what we're looking at is we're looking above different colours indicating the collapsed roof, the blue, the posts for the dwelling. Here we can see the central, the green post, the red, the palisade, have these collapsed structures, these very richly preserved floors of material culture. And yes, there's the ceramics there and beads, the metalwork as we'd expect for late Bronze Age sites, the ceramics, but also wood, and just a wonderful collection of preserved textiles. What's interesting about Must Farm is all of these textiles are plant fibre. And this isn't because there wasn't wool. I've already showed you there was wool in other places at this time. And they are there because of the burial environment. That soil matrix has preserved the wool, whereas it's the contrary at Must Farm. The wool is not preserved. I'm sure it was there, but all we see in terms of the actual artifacts excavated are the plant fibres. There are 5 different types of artifact from Must Farm. There are fibres, the plant material processed into fibres. There's the thread, so yarns, cords, including those wound onto sticks or balls. There's the textiles, which I've been talking about for other sites. Twined fabrics, which we've also come across when I was talking about the early Bronze Age short kiss burials. And knotted fabrics, just a fragment of that. And what's really remarkable is that, yes, we've been able to talk about the textiles and the twine fabrics elsewhere, but this whole production process of the fibre and making the yarns, this isn't visible in other contexts, because here we're looking at a settlement where people were making things. Or if we think about it, the other sites that I've been talking about, these are burial sites, people are being buried in clothing, but they're not being buried with all the material for making these fabrics. So the settlement site is really wonderful, unique evidence. And so some of that is the way that people processed flax fibre. So flax from the linen plant is stripping these bast fibres, and they're keeping these in balls of fibre. So not exactly balls of yarn. We're used to balls of wool, but here it's the fibre product that's being wrapped and kept tidily in these bundles. Again, we have the technology of yarn production. And once again, we're looking at kind of variation of splice technology, but on a much finer level than for the cord. People using strips of fibre and working them together into fine yarns. And they're using those to make textiles. And this is an example shown, a photograph at large scale, the scale's in millimeters. And I just think this photograph, although it's black and it's been charred and it would once have been light coloured and bright and lovely, I hope this photograph gives a sense of actually the beautiful quality of the weaving at this site. And these are some of the details. For those who know something about textiles, this thread count of 14 to 29 threads per centimetre at Must Farm is actually, it's a very good quality textiles. Our tea towels are somewhere around 11 to 14 today. At Must Farm, there's a wonderful assemblage of twined fabrics. I've talked to you about that before, and it's fantastic to see these continuing on throughout the millennia with examples that also have all sorts of tufts, so variations that were creating these thicker tufted fabrics. Oh, sorry, I thought I had another one on Must Farm. But I wanted to give you a snapshot there of what's these technologies, how they've developed really over time, but also the great continuity of these. But Must Farm adding in that sense of the production in a settlement site, of people making these, the industry, the way people would have been using lime bast and for the twining and the flax to make the textiles. So these are plants in their environment they were using for fibre. The last site I'm just going to wrap up on actually sneaks out of the Bronze Age, but as we're looking from Kilmartin and I'm wanting to show you some of the really great early finds from Scotland, I wanted to include this. And this is a fragment of textile that comes from Oakbank Crannog in Loch Tay. It was excavated in the 1990s, and this was an underwater excavation. So once again, we're looking at the waterlogged deposit here. But this was not charred, and this is just waterlogged, and this was conducive then for the preservation of wool. So this is the textile fragment here. This grey image is the micrograph of the fibre, and if you look closely, you can see the scales that are characteristic of plant fibre, so a bit like the hair on our head if you've ever seen blown-up pictures of that. And what's interesting about the Oakbank Crannog textile is that this has a different kind of weave. I told you that the Bronze Age weaves were the plain weave, the simple one under, one over. But this, we're looking at the early Iron Age now. If you look at the dates, we're looking at the 5th, 4th century BCE. We're looking at 400 years later than Must Farm. And what we see is this innovation in weave, a slightly different diagram. This is a twill weave. Here, the threads are floating over two and under one, over two and under one, which creates this textured textile that I'm showing you here in the front and back. If we think then about the wool fibre, I'm showing you a similar diagram that I just showed you from the Rilston burial. But if you see in that profile of the diameter of the wool fibres, you can see they're much more clustered towards the finer fibres. And this we're seeing, although there aren't many examples to look at in Britain, what we're seeing is just what we'd expect to see, actually, more broadly understanding this in the European context, is that the evolution of the sheep fleece people have bred that fleece to have a finer texture, to have finer fibres. And this is just what we see being used in that textile. And so this is a finer quality wool, would have been softer to the touch, wouldn't have that hairy, itchy quality that maybe the Bronze Age wools may have had. The Oakbank textile, when you look at that brown, if you look carefully, maybe you can see that some of the yarns look slightly lighter and some look slightly darker than the others. Now, this is probably because these yarns were naturally pigmented and people are using slightly darker and lighter colour fibres to create their yarns, to create a texture, because actually this creates a very nice texture with these twill weaves, this alternating. Now, the dye analysis that was done in the 1990s didn't come out with any traces of dye in the Oakbank textile. But actually, at this point in time, people were definitely dyeing textiles. In the earlier Bronze Age, it's not clear if people were dyeing textiles, but by now, certainly people were. And so if we go to thinking about the reconstruction, the clothing, these reconstructions where people are forced to interpret the clothing, and based on the archaeological evidence, actually colour was more prevalent by this point. And so this is clothing based on examples from the Arras culture in Yorkshire, where there are a number of wool preserved textiles, and here's showing that colour. And I think this is quite right by this point, that not only do people have the natural pigmented yarn and these slightly different weaves, but also colour within the textiles. So that's where I want to leave it today. I hope that I've given the idea of these big changes in the materiality of textiles in Scotland in this period, and also the real importance of some of the Scottish material for understanding points in time, the early twined fabrics, the wool textiles, the evolution of the sheep fleece, how important it is for using this evidence, then piece that together across the Britain and the neighbouring regions to try and understand what was happening in this period of time. At this very early use of textiles, this technology that's just been so important in the history of the British Isles, and to find the roots of it here. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. That was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed that. And it just gets me thinking about, I always think about the way that we classify prehistory as in the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Stone Ages, and you kind of, they're characterized by what we find, and all that remains from these periods, the hoards or the stone axes. And I think I'm sometimes guilty of forgetting there's such a prevalence of textiles, of rope, of cordage, of clothing, the kind of day-to-day stuff that would have just been everywhere. But unfortunately, it just doesn't survive in the archaeological records so well. So it's really great to see you provide some illumination on the kind of what has survived. Yeah, that was fantastic. So at this point, I'll just open up the chat to anyone who has questions. So there are two ways of asking questions. If anyone is interested, you can put in a question into the chat box, or you can raise your hand. You just need to go down to the reactions button or icon on your device and raise your hand, and you can ask a question to Susanna. So if anyone has any questions about what's been discussed or about textiles and prehistory, by all means, fire away. Everyone's a bit shy tonight, Susanna.
Everyone's a bit shy. Well, have some time to think about it. I'm really happy to answer your questions.
Oh, they're flooding in now. So MC, well, first of all, Maggie Sims says, thank you, very interesting. But MC says, really fascinating, thank you for presenting. I wanted to ask if the Crantit textile is included in your Cist burial group. I excavated it in 1998, but I've never been able to see further follow-up on it.
Which one's this one? No, it isn't. And I wonder if that means it isn't published. So I have to look that up. One of the things that happens is that sometimes these finds just, don't find their way into the published literature. So what was it like, can I ask? What do you think it was?
Hi, sure. It's Marcia here. Hi. It was a Cist burial excavation in Crantit Neolithic tomb, and we had Julian Richards up doing a Meet the Ancestors program with it. It was guarded who excavated it. So there will be a grey literature publication somewhere, but because it's such an early date, I couldn't ever find it. and I kind of left archaeology about 3 or 4 years later. So it would be really fascinating to find out. I think I've got photographs of it if you need it.
Oh,
But
that would be fantastic. Yes.
string, I want to say knotted. I'm not a textile expert, but I was fascinated by it. There was droplets of copper on it, so it was a mineralized preservation, and it was possibly a bag that held some of the cremated bone in it. When we first opened it, there was a crack in the tomb of the Cist capstone, and we just sort of glanced in, thinking it was a pile of leaves or something, and just covered it. And then when I actually got round to, once the excavation of the tomb had been done, I actually got round to actually digging it. It turned out to be really quite something special. So,
oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So, yeah, I would love it if you send pictures. And so you said Guard excavated it in 1998.
Yeah, that's right.
Gives me somewhere to start.
Okay, well, that's great to know, because I would like it to appear in the literature somewhere, because I think it's a good one. So I'll get in touch with you through Ken and the group, okay?
Wonderful. I'm easy to find because my email address is my Glasgow website. So please, that would be lovely. Thank you so much.
Get in touch. Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Martha. Morg KA has just wanted to say, thanks for this. I am a spinner, and it blows my mind how fine they could spin in those days. Perhaps you could elaborate on that a little bit as well, Susanna.
I agree. The Must Farm yarns in particular were really fine. And there's a wonderful find at Must Farm that was, so as you briefly saw, there's whether they're spools or part of spindles or bobbins, it's not quite sure. So that the thread wound around the dowels of wood. There were two of these nestled together in a little bit of textile, and the flax the flax fibre yarn was 1/10 of a millimetre in diameter. Now that could have shrunk a bit. I think it would have shrunk a bit because of the loss of mass as it underground at the time, but not. But even if it's double that, even if it's 1/5 of a millimetre in diameter, that's incredibly fine. Much finer than the linen fabrics we have today, and it is remarkable. And if you are at all familiar with some of the Egyptian textiles, it was just ridiculously fine yarns used to weave the textiles. I mean, of these dimensions. And yes, it is. And part of how that was probably achieved is because of this technology of splicing rather than spinning. So stripping fibers from the plant and twisting them together. So not the draft spinning approach. I mean, it's hard to understand exactly what technology they're using, but this seems to be one of the ways that's helping that. So yeah, it's a really good comment, and it is remarkable. Yes.
Thanks, Susanna. Hukubi has asked, have they confirmed that the thread spools from Must Farm are nettle?
No, they're not. They are flax. When we were initially looking at these, they looked to have characteristics of nettle, but over time, through the analysis, working here with my colleague Margarita Glaber, it became apparent that some of the shapes that we're looking at, of course, it's not like looking at modern material where you have well-preserved fibers. Some of those shapes had changed due to the burial environment. So these are all identified as flax and linen. Well, I say flax and linen. I say both because it's the flax plant, but we call that linen as it becomes a fiber, as you probably know. So yeah, disappointingly a little bit, but also interestingly in terms of the science, This is coming from the flax plant, Linum usitatissimum.
Thanks for that. I just closed down the chat by mistake there. We have another question from Hilary, which I think is a great question. How might you find out about dyes and colour?
Yeah, this is a great question, actually. So there's an element of sometimes looking very closely, first of all, at different shades of brown. So it can be just little tinge changes of colour, as I got you to look at the oak bank textile. And then there's forms of chemical analysis where you're using, you're extracting just tiny solutions from the fibre to try and detect any traces of dye stuff. For the Bronze Age, there's been quite a number of projects, maybe less so in Britain due to some of the complexities of the preservation. So charred material, for example, at Must Farm is very hard to analyse in that way. But actually, looking more broadly across Europe, it's very rare to find dyed textiles in the Bronze Age. It's somewhere at the end of the second millennium BC that more dyed textiles become apparent. So going into that late Bronze Age, there were probably dyed textiles. I mean, there might have been painted textiles before. I'm sure people were always interested in colour. So I'm sure there were ways to do this. But the dyeing seems to be a technology of that later period of the Bronze Age. So I tried to do, well, I sampled to do the dye analysis for the textiles at Must Farm, but we didn't find any. And so the search goes on, but it is an interesting period that, in fact, it's quite likely a lot of them weren't dyed and they're using the natural colours of the wool and the plants mostly. But yeah, it remains a question that I'm sure people will carry on trying to understand better that horizon of early dye.
Do you think in that case, coloured wools, coloured dyes used in clothing might have indicated some sort of prestige in the community?
Yes, I'm sure. And actually, talking of thinking of the Bronze Age, with the evolution of the sheep fleece, actually one of the things that evolves in the sheep fleece is from being predominantly dark pigmented sheep. So the wild sheep are dark pigmented to white sheep. So part of that evolution was evolving to not have darkly pigmented sheep fleece in a preference for white wool. And of course, white wool may well have been stunning. Well, it's stunning in its own right. It's startling and it's different from the dark wool. But also, of course, it takes colour in a different way. And so if you want to dye, you can dye dark wool and it will change its colour. But to get those bright colours, you want to dye white. So yes, I think these bright colours would have looked fabulous and surely striking. They're another technology, they're a little bit mysterious. For those of you who dye things, you'll know it doesn't always work quite the way you think. So you can end up with, colours that weren't quite as great. So it's a whole skill in itself. And yeah, I'm sure having dyed clothes was a matter of status and interest.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I was fascinated to learn while I was on Ardlanish weavers on the island of Mull last week that you can obtain dye from onion skins. So whether that makes you smell like onions, I don't know, but I just think it's fascinating the kind of range of colours that can be obtained from seemingly innocuous sources.
Yeah, of course, because plants are the main source of natural dye. Not the only one, but yeah, so all sorts of plants unexpectedly having wonderful colours.
Perhaps even bluebells like the ones that you get down at Temple Wood in Kilmartin. I don't know if that's
I've not heard of it, but maybe other people have. And quite often, actually, dyes aren't the colour that they look. So things like, blackberries you might think are going to create a lovely purple colour, but they can be grey. But there's a whole chemistry to dyeing, and it depends on the metals that you might put with the dye and the mordants. So actually one plant can dye a whole range of colours. So there's recipes involved.
Great, thanks, Susanna. That's really lovely. Another question from Maggie Sims, wildcard question this time. But any views as to what is being depicted in garments worn in Sumerian depictions of around 2000 BCE, like on the standard of our in the British Museum? Are you able to prefer an opinion there?
Oh, great. Well, yes, there's a number of different ideas here about these textured textiles. So as you weave textiles, you can weave tufts into the textiles to create a pile. So, you know, you're sort of weaving fringes and tufts into them. So that, I think that's the sort of technique being used there. There are various theories. It could in one way be the fleece, sheep fleece itself, but I think it's more likely to have been some kind of textile by that point in that area, which is well known for its textile technologies. But yes, they are really fascinating, and they are found in these important ritualistic scenes. So for some people, they also interpret these as particularly having special meaning connected to those contexts.
Thanks. Well, back to the UK now. Just wondering. So this is from Kim. Just wondering if there is any evidence or theories of the making of felted wool.
That's a very nice question. It was probably quite hard to find the earliest felt, and for the periods that I'm looking at, there's no evidence for felt. So felt traditions are important in Central Asia, for example. This could be because it might be very hard to spot felt in the archaeological record. You know, a little tiny bit of textile has structure to it, it has pattern. You can see that when you're digging or when you find something. But what does happen is that during the Iron Age, and certainly in the Roman period, textiles themselves are fulled, which is a felting that happens after the textile's woven. That piece of wool textile I showed you from the Crannog Centre, it isn't fulled, which is when you take your wool textile and you'll wash it and pound it in water to create a felted surface. Sometimes you can barely see the textile underneath. Now, in the Roman period, this felting is carried out on, this fulling is carried out on, most of the wool textiles to a certain extent. But in the Crannog Centre, interestingly, that's not going on. So the question you're asking, I think, of the just straightforward felt, that's hard to see, and we don't see it in these earlier periods or in Britain. So only, moving on into later periods. So, but that idea of felting the wool does happen, but after the textiles have been woven.
I'm really sad that I'm in the office tonight, because I could have shown you all the lovely bit of felted wool scene that I'd made of a dune by Argyll, which was a lot of fun. So if you've never done felting before, then I'd highly recommend it. And I wasn't awful at it, and I usually am at these kind of things. Portia Askew is also asking, is there collaboration with other textiles experts looking to create, and I know this can take years due to a lack of publication of data on some sites, a database for all materials from the prehistoric period with a view to a definitive book?
Yeah, what a project. There is a project at the moment which is a European textile network called Euroweb, where many textile experts are involved, and the plan is to bring together a big digital atlas. So there you go, something to look out for. And while it might not be everything, but it surely won't be everything, because it will be what people can put into that database. I think it will be really excellent. For the British material, there's a lovely online resource called CINBA, CINBA. I think it's cinba.net. It's a textile project which has a database of British textiles. But what's always really difficult to find are these unpublished textiles, or things that are published in the grey literature, which is what we talked about right at the beginning, the granite textile. It's just really hard to find that material, because unless people tell you where to start searching, it's just really hard to find it. But anyways, there's there we go. There's CINBA, and the European network it's a cost network, and it's called Euroweb. It's based at the University of Warsaw in Poland. So if you Google, you should be able to find that. That won't be out for a couple of 2-3 years. But there we go. I think that will be a really great resource.
Super, thank you. Apologies if you can hear a Hoover in the background, but we've got time for 3 more questions, I think, maybe 4 if we're lucky. Tukavi's just wanting to follow up on the previous question about the nettles at Must Farm. She just wanted to mention, although I have some very long nettle fibres, it is much easier to process flax to be thin and clean. So thanks, Puku. Carl Hewitt would like to ask, you showed us images of ceramics from Kilmartin with textile impressions. Are there any actual Bronze Age textile remains at Kilmartin?
It's not that I know of. It's these impressions of cord on the ceramics. So that's as close as we get there. And yeah, that's, I would imagine the word textiles, we don't see them.
I was just going to follow up with, I think, no, unfortunately. Very little remains from any of the burials, actually, that we have in Kilmartin Glen. The Upper Largy burial that you mentioned being one of the kind of more complete burials. Almost everything else in the Glen was excavated in the 1860s. And although there are some accounts of human remains being found, it's likely that these were reburied because it was a deacon of Durham Cathedral who made several of these excavations, William Greenwell. And so these have disappeared really from the archaeological record, because we presume that he gave them a good, decent Christian burial to these poor Bronze Age people. So we don't know where they have turned up, or whether any textiles were found alongside them, but probably not. And like I say, very little remains of anything else that we've uncovered. So that's an unfortunate thing with textiles, is that, as you've discussed at length tonight, Susanna, ultimately textiles, fabrics, cord, string, etc., very important to these societies, but unfortunately they just don't exist so much in the archaeological record. But who knows what might turn up in future excavations.
The good thing is, when they do exist, actually from just a small amount of textile, you can find out a great deal. So because of the technology, because you can see the fibres, the yarns, the weave. So that's one of the great things, is that even if there's just a small fragment, actually you can understand a lot about the technology with the right analysis.
Absolutely, it's real granular detail that you can extract so much and extrapolate from there as well. So that's the kind of magic of archaeology today. So I think that was it. Just to mention to Pip, whose computer unfortunately crashed at the start, this has been recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you've not subscribed to that, please do. And go and check out our website for future talks. We've got a talk coming up on the 30th this month with Davy Donaldson, who's a Scottish Traveller advocate, which will be on Scottish Traveller history and heritage, and maybe even a little bit of archaeology. And our next talk will be in July with Treasure Trove Unit Scotland, who will be discussing metal detecting and treasure trove in Scotland. So please do sign up for that if you're interested. But I think in the meantime, if everybody wouldn't mind humouring me for a minute or two, you're quite welcome to turn your camera on, but certainly turn your sound on. I think Susanna deserves a round of applause for that wonderful talk. So if we could all give her that, would be fantastic. So again, Susanna, thank you so much for giving that talk. Lovely to see you again. And thanks for everyone for turning up. Kim has just asked, Ken, are we able to see a photo of your felted picture on the museum's website? Not sure it's quite that good. I'm not sure it's quite deserving of a space on the website, but it is somewhere on social media. So go and check that out. I think I'll just say good night to everybody and thanks again for attending. I hope to see you all very soon, but in the meantime, please enjoy the rest of your evening and good night and goodbye.